Catherine Whitmore arrived in Blackridge just before midnight. The bus rumbled to a stop at the empty station, its headlights cutting through the mist. She stepped off, gripping her bag tightly, and took a deep breath. The air felt thick and charged, as if the town itself was awake and watching. Blackridge had always been strange. Even as a child visiting her grandmother during the summers, Catherine had noticed the way the streets never emptied, the way the lights in the houses never went out. The townspeople were always awake, walking, working, whispering. And now she was back. The reason? A letter from her late grandmother. Catherine, you must return. There's something you need to see. The town is sick. I tried to stop it, but I failed. Please, before it's too late. Her grandmother had died 2 weeks ago. The letter arrived yesterday. Catherine's footsteps echoed as she walked toward the house at the end of the street. Blackridge was alive. Figures moved behind curtains. Voices murmured from alleyways. The hum of unseen activity filling the air. She passed the diner, where people sat drinking coffee, as if it were the middle of the afternoon. Across the street, an old man rocked on his porch, watching her with unblinking eyes. When she reached her grandmother's house, the door was unlocked. Inside, the air was stale, and the furniture covered in sheets. But something was off. There were no signs of her grandmother ever leaving. A cup of tea sat on the table, still full. A chair was pushed back as if she had stood up suddenly. It was as if she had simply vanished. Then Catherine saw the journal on the nightstand. She flipped it open, her grandmother's handwriting scrawled in frantic ink. It's not insomnia. It's not a coincidence. The town doesn't sleep because it doesn't. It watches. It waits. The moment you close your eyes, it takes you. Actually, Catherine's heart pounded. She looked around the house, the shadows stretching in unnatural ways. A whisper brushed against her ear. Don't fall asleep, Catherine. The lights flickered. Outside, the townspeople stood still, staring at her house. And then they started walking toward her. Catherine's breath hitched as she stepped back from the window. The townspeople moved in eerie unison, their footsteps soundless against the pavement. Their eyes wide, unblinking, reflected the dim glow of the streetlights. Her grandmother's words pounded in her mind. The moment you close your eyes, it takes you. Catherine snatched up the journal, flipping through the pages with trembling fingers. More frantic notes, more warnings. I tried to leave. The town wouldn't let me. The ones who sleep disappear. They don't wake up. They become part of it. They watch me. They're always watching. A sharp knock at the door made her jump. Catherine, a voice called. A voice she knew. Daniel, her childhood friend. The only boy in Blackridge she had ever trusted, but he had changed since she left. His letters had stopped, his presence in the town becoming little more than a rumor. Slowly, she crept toward the door. Daniel! Catherine, open up. His voice was calm, too calm. You shouldn't be here. She hesitated, staring through the peephole. He stood alone on the porch, but behind him, the others were still coming. Their movements were too slow, too unnatural. She gripped the doorknob. What's happening? A long pause, then softer. They know you're awake. Her pulse pounded. Who? He exhaled sharply. The town. Catherine stepped back. That doesn't make sense. Daniel's hand pressed against the door. Catherine, listen to me. You need to leave before sunrise. If you stay awake too long, it will notice. If you fall asleep, it will take you. There's no in between. Her grandmother's words flashed in her mind. I tried to leave. The town wouldn't let me. Her chest tightened. Then why are you still here? Daniel hesitated. Because I never left. The doorknob rattled. Catherine, his voice was urgent now. You don't have time to question this. Just... The lights flickered again. The street outside darkened, and the people stopped walking. For the first time since she arrived, the town was completely silent. A chill ran through Catherine's body. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if something unseen had woken up. Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. Catherine, run. Catherine's heartbeat thundered in her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. The silence outside was worse than the whispers. The townspeople had stopped moving, but their heads were all turned toward the house, their unblinking eyes locked on her door. Daniel banged against it. "Catherine, now!" She snapped out of her trance, shoving the journal into her bag. She had no plan, just the overwhelming need to get out. She yanked open the back door, stepping into the overgrown yard. The wind howled through the trees, but something felt wrong about it. It wasn't natural. It was watching. A shadow shifted at the edge of her vision. Catherine spun. Nothing was there, just the rustling of leaves, the distant glow of streetlights. Then the back gate creaked open. Daniel. His face was pale, his eyes darting behind her. "Come on." She didn't hesitate. They moved quickly, slipping into the alley between the houses. The whole town was awake, but not a single person moved. It was as if they were frozen in time, waiting. Catherine kept close to Daniel. "What's happening?" she whispered. He didn't answer. They weaved through the town, the streets stretching unnaturally long, the buildings seeming to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Finally, Daniel stopped in front of the diner. "Inside," he said. The neon sign flickered overhead. The diner looked normal. Warm lights, an empty booth, the smell of coffee lingering in the air. But as soon as Catherine stepped inside, the air changed. The outside world fell away. The sounds of the town disappeared. Catherine turned to Daniel, panic rising in her chest. "Where are we?" Daniel exhaled. "The only place it doesn't watch." Catherine stared at him. "What is it?" His jaw tightened. "You already know." She thought of the journal, the warnings, the way the town never slept. She thought of the letter from her grandmother sent after she had died. The realization sent ice through her veins. "The town is alive," Daniel nodded, "and it doesn't want you to leave." Catherine felt the walls closing in. The town had let her return, but now it had noticed her, and there were only two choices: stay awake forever, or sleep and become part of it. Her hands clenched into fists. "No, there has to be another way." She looked at Daniel. "How do we kill a town?" He hesitated, then slowly slid something across the table. A rusted key. "This," he said. "But if we use it, there's no going back." Catherine picked it up, the cold metal pressing into her palm. She took a deep breath. Catherine tightened her grip on the rusted key. It felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of every secret the town had buried. She met Daniel's gaze. "Where does it go?" He hesitated. "Under the town." A chill ran through her. "There's something under Blackridge?" Daniel nodded. "It's not just a town, Catherine. It's a prison. And that key, it unlocks what's been buried for over a century." Catherine's mind spun. The town didn't sleep because it couldn't. It was trapped in an endless waking nightmare, bound by something deep beneath its foundations. Her grandmother had known. Had she tried to stop it? Had it killed her for trying? Catherine pushed back the fear clawing at her chest. "Where do we start?" Daniel glanced toward the diner's back door. "The tunnels. They run beneath the entire town." Catherine's pulse quickened. "And if we go down there?" His expression darkened. "We either set the town free, or we never come back." The entrance to the tunnels was behind the abandoned church on the outskirts of town. Catherine and Daniel moved fast, keeping to the shadows as they weaved through Blackridge's frozen streets. The people were still standing, still staring, their eyes locked on something unseen. Catherine gritted her teeth. They know what we're doing. The church was worse than she remembered, its stone walls cracked, its wooden doors rotting. Daniel led her around the side where a rusted metal hatch lay hidden beneath the overgrown grass. "This is it," he said. Catherine hesitated. "How do you know about this?" Daniel swallowed. "Because I tried to escape once. The town let me think I could. But I woke up back in my bed. I never even made it out. A cold shiver ran through her. Daniel knelt and forced the hatch open with a groan of metal. A damp, stale smell rose from the darkness below. Catherine peered into the tunnel stretched endlessly beneath the town, its walls carved from ancient stone. No turning back now. They climbed down, the air thick and suffocating. Their footsteps echoed as they walked, the darkness pressing in around them. Then Catherine saw them, markings carved into the walls. Strange, twisting symbols, their meaning just out of reach. She ran her fingers over them. These were made a long time ago. Daniel's voice was low. By the ones who trapped it. Catherine's mind reeled. Someone had sealed the town into its endless wakefulness. But why? The answer came when they reached the end of the tunnel. A massive iron door, covered in the same symbols. And in the center of it, a keyhole. Catherine's breath hitched. This is it, she whispered. Daniel pulled out the journal from her bag and flipped to one of the last entries. He read aloud, his voice echoing. The door must never be opened. The key must never be used. The town must remain awake, or the dreamer will wake too. Catherine's fingers curled around the key. The dreamer? Daniel's voice was barely audible. The thing beneath the town. Catherine's blood turned to ice. The town hadn't been cursed to stay awake. It was keeping something else asleep. Something that should never wake. Her hand trembled over the keyhole. If we unlock this, Daniel exhaled. We don't know what happens. Catherine looked back down the tunnel. The town wasn't just watching. It was waiting. Waiting for her to decide. Her heart pounded. If they left now, she could try to live with it. Go back to pretending this was just a strange town with a strange curse. But she knew that wasn't an option. The town would never let her go. Catherine met Daniel's gaze. And then, without another word, she slid the key into the lock. The key slid into the lock with a soft click. Catherine hesitated, her breath shallow. The iron door loomed before her, cold and unyielding. Daniel swallowed hard. Catherine, if we open this, we might not be able to stop whatever's inside. Catherine's fingers tightened around the key. Then we make sure we're ready. She turned it. A deep, shuddering groan echoed through the tunnel. The symbols on the door glowed a sickly gold before flickering out. Dust rained from the ceiling as the air grew heavy, charged with something ancient. And then slowly the door opened. The darkness beyond was suffocating. A thick, unnatural fog slithered out, curling around Catherine's ankles like fingers reaching for her. The air was colder here, wrong in a way that made her stomach twist. Daniel raised the flashlight, its weak beam cutting into the gloom. God! Catherine's breath hitched. Beyond the door lay a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in shadows, and at its center, a figure. It stood motionless, wrapped in decayed cloth, its features obscured by an elaborate mask carved from bone. Chains hung from its limbs, driven deep into the ground, glowing with the same symbols that had been on the door. And then, the figure moved. A slow, shuddering breath, as if inhaling for the first time in centuries. The chains rattled. The walls trembled. Catherine's pulse pounded in her ears. The town hadn't just been cursed to stay awake. It had been keeping something asleep. Daniel took a step back. We need to go. Now. The figure raised its head. The air shook. The fog thickened. And then in a voice that scraped against reality itself. You should not have done that. The chains snapped. The town above them screamed. And the dreamer woke. A deep, guttural rumble shook the ground beneath them. The air turned thick, pressing against Catherine's chest like an invisible weight. The figure in the chamber straightened, the tattered cloth around its body shifting with an unnatural slowness, like something moving in the water. Catherine grabbed Daniel's arm. We have to go. But the moment she stepped back, the world bent. The tunnel behind them stretched too far, twisting into a corridor that hadn't been there before. The walls pulsed like they were alive, their ancient carvings shifting, watching. Daniel's grip on the flashlight tightened. It's not letting us leave. The figure took a slow step forward, the chains dragging behind it like dead weight. The fall thickened, swallowing the ground. Catherine's breath came fast. What is it? Daniel's voice was hoarse. The reason the town never sleeps. The figure lifted its hand. A rush of cold slammed into them, knocking Catherine off her feet. She hit the stone floor hard, gasping as her vision blurred. The room swam, or maybe it was reality itself bending around them. A voice, deep and layered with something ancient, crawled through the air. You have freed me. The chains snapped one by one, each break sending a tremor through the tunnels. The carvings on the walls flickered, their glow fading. Catherine pushed herself up, her hands trembling. We made a mistake. Daniel hauled her to her feet. We need to stop it. Now. But the dreamer turned its hollow gaze to them, and suddenly, the world shifted. Catherine was no longer in the chamber. She stood in the middle of Blackridge. But something was wrong. The streets stretched on endlessly. The buildings twisted at impossible angles. The sky was too dark, as if the stars had been swallowed whole. And the townspeople, they stood frozen in the streets, their bodies hovering inches above the ground, their mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes were wide, but they weren't looking at her. They were looking at something above her. Catherine turned slowly. The dreamer loomed over the town, its form towering, shifting, its mask now cracked and broken. It was awake, and the town was no longer keeping it trapped. It was keeping them trapped with it. Daniel's voice cut through the suffocating stillness. Catherine! She turned and saw him running toward her, struggling against the weight of the dream itself. His movements were slow, like he was pushing through deep water. Catherine clenched her fists. Think! Think! The key! It had locked the dreamer away once. Could it do it again? Her gaze darted around the warped town. If the key was the answer, then a glint of metal. Her breath caught. The key lay at the foot of the town's clock tower, the only thing that hadn't changed. Catherine ran. The dreamer moved, its shadow stretching toward her. The ground tilted, buildings bending, streets folding in on themselves. The townspeople screamed without making a sound. Catherine threw herself forward, hitting the ground beside the key. Her fingers closed around it just as the dreamer's shadow reached her. And then, instinct guiding her, she slammed the key into the ground. A deep crack split the air. The dreamer froze. The entire town shuddered. The darkness fractured, splintering like glass. And then everything collapsed. Catherine gasped as she hit the cold, hard ground. She was back in the tunnels. The iron door stood before her, sealed shut once again. The symbols on it glowed faintly, their golden light flickering, then fading into stillness. Daniel groaned beside her. Are we back? Catherine stared at the door. The air was quiet again. She exhaled a shaky breath. I think we won. Daniel sat up, wincing. Did we? Catherine didn't have an answer. But the town was still standing. The nightmare was over. At least, for now. Subscribe for more of these stories. Like and click the notification button.